And we're live.
Hello, everyone. This is DJ Aceman and Big Don here today for the Peace and Chaos program. Today we are back, and today is a very um, memorable day here in the US. Today is the 20th anniversary of 9/11. So today we're going to open with a moment of silence to honor the victims and everyone who was impacted by those tragic days. Thank you. 20 years ago today, the United States was under attack. It was under attack by a group of terrorists that many underestimated. On that day, thousands of Americans and people of other nationalities were killed in New York City, in Arlington, Virginia, and in a small town in Pennsylvania. The acts of that day have shown how terrorism has impacted so many people and how us as a nation will have to overcome living in an evil world. But since then, we've also learned a lot. We have learned to come together. Prior to 9/11, the US was in a bit of a political turmoil with the 2000 election. But ever since then, and ever since the tragic day of 9/11, 2001, the country came together and became resilient. Tonight, we will honor all those who fell on 9/11 and all the heroes that we have lost since then. Tonight is going to be a episode where we are going to reflect on 9/11, how life has changed, and we will also discuss that day in depth. Also going to talk about what has gone on today, specifically with the ceremonies of 9/11 today here all over the country. We're going to discuss a little bit about that, and we're going to discuss all the impacts that it has had to us as a nation and also to the world. So thank you, everyone, and we're going to get started. So Big Don, how's it going?
Well, it's been 20 years since
Mm,
9/11. I can't believe we come this far.
yeah, I know. I think although it has been 20 years, for a lot of people it still feels like yesterday because it's one of those days that if you ask anyone where were you on 9/11, I'm sure they could have a memory come up really quickly. And it's a thing for a lot of people that I think they'll never forget. And I'm sure if you ask them for any other day, like, hey, do you remember what happened on April whatever 2009? They would say, what happened? Nothing. But if you ask them what happened on September 11th, 2001, they can tell you, and they can tell you what they did that day. It's because this day will go down in history as a day that no one will ever forget, whether you were born or you were not born. This day, and it's modern too. This is not something like um, Pearl Harbor where we don't really have a lot of accounts of. With September 11th, we live in an era where it was only 20 years ago, and most people are still alive to recount that. Who weren't at ground zero or at anywhere else. And there are still people out there that um, can recount that. So, it's something that's why it feels like it still feels like yesterday for a lot of people because, you know, it was only 20 years ago. And that might seem like a long time to some people, but to others, that was just yesterday. So, yeah. Now, for all those checking in with us right here, right now, um, this is just a little bit of a backstory here. So we have been off for a couple weeks now. Big Don and I have been kind of moving away. I moved to a new place, got a job. Big Don is back at school. So we have been a little bit busy for this semester, but just to let you all know, we still will be having these live streams. Um, we're just gonna probably do them every other week, or it's not gonna be every single week. To let you all know, that was just a
Yeah,
little bit of a backstory.
it's probably gonna be a lot less frequent, and you could probably expect more I guess video content from us instead
Yeah,
of
we're
streaming.
Yeah, we're gonna do a lot of video content. I think it's just because of how busy we're getting again. Like in the summer, we were grinding every single week we would put out content for you. We'd do some RL stuff. We'd have some other videos on the side like GeoGuessr. But I think for the fall, expect a little bit less of the live streams, but more of some videos like GeoGuessr, political videos, things like that and of that nature, because we're going to be busy. I know that a lot of you all are busy too. You guys are all working, and some of us can't make it to the live stream, and we completely understand. So we're going to be doing a lot more kind of just content that comes out whenever, and you guys can watch whenever. And don't feel an obligation to go watch our live stream. I know you guys are all busy, so the live stream is there for whenever you want to watch it. You could watch it 2 weeks later, you could watch it whenever. So we are still going to do live streams, but it's going to be less frequent. We're going to have a lot of videos though, and a lot of content. And also we're going to have a lot of stuff on our social medias. We linked our social media in on the banner on our homepage. So you can just
Yep,
go on
and you can
there.
also find it in the description of this
Yep.
stream.
Yep, you can go check it out there. Peace and Chaos P1 on Twitter. You have Peace and Chaos Podcast on Peace and Chaos _ podcast on Instagram. And also we are on Spotify as well. Just look up Peace and Chaos program on there to let you all know about that. Tonight is a very solemn episode, as you can hear. Today is 9/11. So we're going to do a lot of recalling and also remembering all those who were lost on 9/11 today. Just a reminder to all those, though, that's our social media, and we're going to begin right here. So 20 years ago today was a day when life changed. 4 flights changed the world. 2 flights were coming from Boston to Los Angeles, a flight from Washington Dulles to Texas, and also one from Newark to San Francisco. 4 flights changed the world. 2 flights that came in from Boston, Massachusetts were intended to go to Los Angeles, but instead ended up being hijacked. And unfortunately, both heading to both the North and South Towers of the World Trade Center. And the other was intended from Dulles to Texas, and that was hijacked and crashed at the Pentagon, killing 13 soldiers. And the final flight, which was heading from Newark, New Jersey to
supposedly
San
Washington.
Francisco, apparently was intended to go to the Pentagon as well. However,
No, I think it was either going to the Pentagon or to the
White House. Yeah. And fortunately, all those on board managed to fight the hijackers and crash Flight 93 into a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And since that day, a lot has changed. A lot has changed. And we'll get into a little bit of that. So on that day, then President George W. Bush was in Sarasota, Florida, reading to a group of first graders. And it was a normal quiet day on a Tuesday. President Bush was just going to hang out and read to some young kids, just like a promotion reading for children and education. And there was reports around 9:20, 9:30 that a small plane crashed into the South Tower, and then reports later that a plane crashed into the North Tower, and the words that President Bush heard were, "America is under attack. America is under attack." About 5 to 7 minutes later, President Bush left that elementary school in Sarasota, Florida, and he boarded a plane first, I believe, to Louisiana, and then flew back on our Air Force One. I think it was an Air Force jet. And since then, a lot of policies were put in place. There was a lot of no fly. A lot of Americans did not want to fly after that. On the policy front, the U.S. Invaded Iraq and also started the war on terror, which we'll talk a little bit about later on in the show. But for the big government acts that were put in place, the TSA was created in 2002, and also the Department of Homeland Security was also created. And under these two institutions, um, the emphasis of keeping the United States and its homeland safe were highly emphasized. Prior to 9/11, a lot of people, there was a lack of security at most airports where honestly you could just go in without a boarding pass and you could board a plane wherever you wanted to go to with minimal to no checks. And that created a lot of red flags. I think that a lot of people did not think this through, but to the terrorists, they saw this as a great opportunity to do this heinous act. And this is what made the U.S. change its security policy and also how airport travel and just in general domestic safety, how that changed a lot as well. But Big Don, I want to get you involved here. I know we've been just kind of going over a little bit about what happened on 9/11. But I want to get you, some of your thoughts on it. You know, I think first we can talk a little bit about the TSA and the Department of Homeland Security. Both were created in 2002. Uh, if you want to, talk a little bit about that, we can get into that.
Well, obviously, we all know the response to why those agencies were created. We obviously want to. I mean, the TSA kind of sucks. I mean, we're not gonna lie here, but
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's it's a hassle, but I mean it's necessary. And I think that a lot of after 9/11, a lot of people, felt that it was necessary because, before there was limited to no security in most airports. And you could pretty much walk on without a boarding pass sometimes as well. It's kind of like a train station today, but I mean with air travel, it's a lot more serious because you're going from one city to another. It's not like you're going from one train stop to another.
yeah, that's true. I mean, could you pull off like some sort of terrorist attack on the train? I don't know. I don't want to theorize that, but
I think
let's see
with
here.
I think with trains though, here's the thing with trains. I think they're less I would say they're less, secure than an airport, of course.
Yeah,
But I think it kind of is like a train in a way because you can just board a train, literally all you need is a card. And in some locations you could literally just walk past, and depending on the city or where you live, there's maybe limited to no security inside train stations also. And that may also be a red flag. But I think it kind of resembles what an airport used to be because with airports you had limited to no security. All you'd go to pretty much was the front desk. They might have like a little security baggage person, but they weren't really doing the whole. Now what they do is we take you off your shoes, you make sure that you don't have anything below above a 3.4 fluid ounces. All electronics need to be resembled. You get pat downs. You have to walk through metal detectors. I mean, they do the whole 9 yards, but they do that for a reason. But with trains, you don't really have that, and that kind of is a little bit of a comparison of what used to be with airports.
yeah. I think one thing to highlight here in terms of policies and agencies that came out after 9/11 is, I mean, we could bring up the Department of Homeland Security, we could bring up the TSA, but I think the most controversial one was the Patriot Act
Mm.
and the NSA being able to pretty much listen in on any call that we want to.
Yeah, let's pull that up because I was going to explain a little bit of that, but I'm really happy that you brought it up. The Patriot Act is something that was created back in 2001, literally a couple weeks after 9/11. But let's go on to it right here. The USA Patriot Act, preserving life and liberty. So in the act, there are also a lot of different provisions in the act. The first provision was it allows investigators to use the tools that were already available to investigate organized crime and drug trafficking. It allows law enforcement to use surveillance against more crimes of terror. It allows federal agents to follow sophisticated terrorists trained to evade detection. It allows law enforcement to conduct investigations without tipping off terrorists. It allows federal agents to ask a court for an order to obtain business records in national security terrorism cases. It goes on to say another provision is the Patriot Act facilitated information sharing and cooperation among government agencies so that they can better connect the dots. Um, so that means they could do with the FBI and other law enforcement and intelligence communities. A third provision was the Patriot Act updated the law to reflect new technologies and new threats. Specifically, it allows law enforcement officials to obtain a search warrant anywhere a terrorist related activity occurred. And it also allows victims of computer hacking to request law enforcement assistance in monitoring the trespassers on their computers. It also increased the penalties for those who committed terrorist crimes. It prohibited the harboring of terrorists and enhanced the inadequate maximum penalties for various crimes likely to be committed by terrorists. It enhanced a number of conspiracy penalties, and the list goes on. So this was highly controversial. For multiple different reasons. We can see some of the arguments here, saying that maybe it's unconstitutional that people would be, investigated by their own government.
Right.
But it was also necessary in a way too, in the way that, I mean, no one really wants the government to, surveil people if they're, honest, or if they're, not in bad intentions with all. But I think a lot of people saw this as, the government had more power,
Yeah.
and that was the thing that a lot of people, I think, were afraid of, who were against this act in the first place. I think that a lot of senators at the time, who maybe are considered a little bit more left leaning in a way, did see this as
A
something that
violation
was,
of like a right.
yeah, sort of a violation. But I think others saw this as a necessary in a way too. I think that after 9/11, I think it was a big wake up call to a lot of lawmakers and people who were politicians. And maybe they saw this, maybe if this was prior to 9/11 and the Patriot Act was introduced for whatever reason, there would be a lot of backlash against it. But I think that with 9/11 and the destruction and all the horrors and everything that occurred with it, I think people understood why this piece of legislation was signed into law by President Bush. And it was basically to prevent any future occurrences of terrorism, any threats, to eliminate any threats and to surveil them so that we can expose them immediately, and that we can bring those to justice immediately, so that nothing, God forbid, ever unfolds. It's a hard thing, because it goes into this as well today. Do you think that the government, has too much of a say in people's lives? Do you think that surveillance is necessary, or do you think that the rights of people need to be, the rights to privacy, need to be, brought to the higher standard? Because it brings up a good question,
Yeah. How much would you have to give up your, I guess, privacy in order to, you know, minimize any sort of national security risks? Because I think it's definitely interesting to ponder from the perspective of how comfortable you really are if you
Mhm.
have this overwhelming entity potentially spying on any sort of phone calls or any any transactions you make.
Mm.
I mean, on the one hand, if you're not doing anything wrong, then I guess you wouldn't really have to worry about it. But still, I think people are very hesitant about it because the amount of power being given here.
Yeah, and I think that, if you told the founding fathers that, hey, 200 X amount of years later, the country is going to have the deadliest terrorist attack in its history, and this is the legislation that we're going to use, they probably would not feel that it's justified to do this Patriot Act. They'd probably say there could be other means and ways, but um, besides the fact, I think that if this type of legislation was introduced back when the country was first founded, it wouldn't end well. But I
Right.
think as time progressed, and again, the founding of our country to the 21st century, when 9/11 occurred, there was a lot of change and innovation in technology. Also, with the country as well, the population, boomed during the 20th century to where we are today. And with that, there were a lot of new societal changes that occurred. You had more people living in the U.S. The government, grew uh, relatively in size. Um, we were living in a globalized world where, things that happen in the U.S. Or things that happen in other parts of the world were actually going to affect the country now. Um, and yeah, the interconnectedness really made it so that was a lot different. So I think that there are two sides to this. I think that some people think that the Patriot Act should not have been signed into law. because they might have saw this as a breach of privacy and a breach of our rights and liberties. But to the others, saying that maybe it's better, to some of the positive rights, positive human rights that the government gives, maybe we can have some limitations on that so that we can have greater safety and security. It's a thing of sacrificing. Do you want to sacrifice your rights for safety and security, or do you want to have your rights and risk having safety and security? It's a two-way street.
I guess that depends on your belief in the people who are given that security.
Hmm.
Because I think right now we live in very politically divisive times. So if you're given, like I said, if you're giving the government that much power, there's obviously going to be distrust in it in terms of which side could abuse it. I mean, take a look at Trump supporters right now. They're here being canceled on social media. Well, what if we take that one step further and say, okay, the government is sort of monitoring sort of my views. Maybe they don't really see that that's like a particularly beneficial or safe for the country.
And I think that's where the interpretation of the act goes wrong. And I mean, today we live in such divided times, and we're actually going to talk about that in a little bit because that was brought up today a lot, a few times actually, during the speech that former President Bush gave in Shanksville about how we need to really come together because 9/11 was the turning point for where the country came together, and where patriotism was pretty much at its all-time high for pretty much the 21st century. 20 years from now, we live in such divided times. And I think that back then, I think a lot of Americans after 9/11 saw the Patriot Act as necessary. But today, I think there is this divide. And even what happened this year with the breach of the Capitol and how this was the Patriot Act could be used against a lot of these perpetrators.
They were used.
It was, yeah, it was used, and it could be used against more as well. And how it has become so politicized. But I think it's because people are afraid that the government is going to intervene with their lives, and I think that's the whole fear.
Yeah, and I think with people within this country, despite kind of generations passing, there's always going to be that hesitancy of, I don't want the government sort of interfering with my life. I mean, in some countries, it might be more acceptable, but I don't think it's really comparable to us with how the sheer scale of things are.
Mm,
Well, it's an interesting situation and sort of a thought experiment amongst Americans.
exactly. It is. Yeah, this has definitely become very controversial since it was first published back in 2001, and it was enacted by the 107th United States Congress. But it still is in effect today. And a lot of people, I mean, thoughts have changed since then due to the changing political climate. However, at the time, there was a lot of Americans who saw this as a necessary law to go into. But let's pivot here. Unless, do you have anything else to say before we pivot into what all the memorials were of today?
Yeah, I think we kind of beat that horse here with our thoughts on the NSA.
Yeah, let's go to what happened today. So today was the 20th anniversary of 9/11. Um, and today there were a lot of memorials. President Biden actually went to all three sites where the planes crashed. He first in the morning today went to the World Trade Center this morning, and he attended with President Obama and former First Lady uh, Michelle Obama. He also attended with former President Bill Clinton and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton.
Here we
He
can
attended.
see
He
we
also
see
attended.
Michael Bloomberg.
Yep, former Mayor Michael Bloomberg, and also Chuck Schumer, Senator Chuck Schumer, and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi was also there as well. along with First Lady Jill Biden, and many others were there as well. President Biden did not speak at any of these events. However, he did urge the message on social media of having unity, of being a country where we can all be united, even though that we may not believe in the same things. And we talked about it earlier. When 9/11 occurred, the country prior to the events occurring, the country was divided politically, culturally, etc., over the divisive election that occurred in 2000 between former Vice President Al Gore and George W. Bush.
Right.
And a lot of people did not see Bush as the president due to how contested that election was. But since that day on 9/11 and President Bush's leadership, a lot of Americans changed and they understood that the bigger picture here is not about who's president, but it's about our country and whether or not we can keep going on being divided, because there was a greater enemy, and that was Al Qaeda and all the terrorists in the Middle East. But today, the message was clear. We live 20 years ago, was a horrible day. And just like the country 20 years ago, the country came together and became resilient. And we never forgot what happened. And I think the message today was clear: to never forget what happened, to be Americans, to come together, and to move on in life with a strong heart.
Yeah, except for the anti-Muslim stuff.
Yeah, that's one thing that unfortunately has come as well, is Islamophobia. And acts of Islamophobia did come up a lot after 9/11. And that was one of the most unfortunate effects after 9/11, was all the racism towards Muslims, all the discrimination towards Muslims, the fear of Muslims as well became a thing. And a lot of people did not understand, the Islamic religion and also the culture that went with it. And they assumed everyone who preached Islam, was a terrorist or someone who was against the United States, which is totally untrue. But unfortunately, that became a remnant of what happened after 9/11. And we could talk a little bit about that as well. I could try to pull up some numbers here. Sorry, one sec. Just bear with us, guys. Just had a little technical difficulty. Trying to pull up some statistics here. Yeah, Islamophobia became something that had to do a lot with September 11th and how Americans feared Muslim Americans. And it was an unfortunate thing. People started discriminating against Arabs who were not even Muslim. A lot of people, feared because they did not know, they didn't understand their culture and they did not believe it. But here are some statistics that I pulled up. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, hate crimes against Muslims in the United States spiked, going from 28 incidents nationwide in the year 2000 to 481 in 2001, according to FBI statistics. Anti-Muslim hate crimes have remained high ever since then, with the FBI recording 219 incidents in the year of 2019. So that right there is a pretty grave statistic that the FBI provided. Although there was some Islamophobia prior to 9/11, it really was not large. You had 28 isolated incidents in 2000 across the US. And right after 9/11, you had 481 in the year of 2001. And, since
Right.
then, although it has gone down a little bit, we're not at those numbers. And, 2000. There's 200 plus incidents every year of people discriminating against Muslims, um, you know, harming them, doing things that honestly should not ever happen. And violence against anyone should not ever exist. And unfortunately, people should learn to coexist. People should learn to understand other people's religions, other people's cultures, and to become culturally competent and not allow stereotypes to dictate how they uh, react and treat others. And it has been an unfortunate thing. And today we live in uh, you know a climate where there's a lot of hate towards Asians over the coronavirus. You saw that last year and this year, where people were assaulting Asian people on the streets, um, name calling them, harassing them, etc., because of something that occurred in an Asian country and that affected the world. And it had nothing to do with being Asian. It was because a lot of people in the climate, saw them as a scapegoat. And you saw this again with Muslim Americans back in post 9/11 era.
Yeah, I think one thing to look over here, if we want to center back to the broader immediate response after 9/11 was, I mean, we definitely saw some unity amongst people, especially in New York. I mean, the response in New York was quite Muslim, probably one of the most resilient responses we ever seen
Mhm.
throughout our modern history in terms of, in the way people kept their heads up and the overall nationalism that's going about. I mean, people were united,
Yep.
but at the same time, I mean, I remember after 9/11, everything was people were questioning, why did they do this? We should go to we immediately jumped the gun on going invading Afghanistan. And I think people had like this very simplistic view of the events that of how things kind of unfolded. And then this overall fear when you look at sort of how the wars were enacted of, you know, oh, these Muslims are bad. We got to, which led to, the invasion of Iraq and much more involvement in the Middle East.
Exactly. And about that nationalism, when you said that, this image came to mind. And I think a lot of people can recognize this image. It's one of the most iconic of the New York firefighters who climbed the rubble and put the American flag back where it should be. And I think that was a big symbol to the country of that we can get up after, you know, something so evil. We can come together and still rise above hate, rise above violence, rise above destruction. And that photo right there, which I have up on the screen, of those heroes, really shows that. It shows the resilience. It shows what being an American is, what it looks like. It shows the patriotism. And I give you a lot of credit, Big Don, for bringing that up, because I do remember, and you can see, you can look it up too, of all the people coming together after that and how patriotism rose after this unfortunate occasion.
Yeah, and I think that you can see definitely we're going to get more into this later on the show when we go over sort of not really our personal accounts because we're too young to remember this, but we grew up in areas deeply affected by 9/11. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the lore of that. But overall, I think it's pretty. Actually, it's quite reflective of sort of the reaction we have in terms of big crises. And we can go back to like we said with COVID, we had this large response in terms of there's obviously some resistance in terms of guidelines, but overall people kind of got with the program of okay, we need to do our part, we need to wash our hands, we need
Mhm.
to make sure we're socially distant, but at the same time we saw a deep rise in Asian hate crime
Mhm.
because oftentimes we like to scapegoat towards particular groups of people, which is unfair, but
It
is what it
is.
is.
You know, it was. And, we saw with 9/11 how people scapegoated Muslim Americans and immigrants from the Middle East and North Africa. And you saw it today with, you might not even be Chinese, and people targeted East Asians or people who looked like if they were from China. People were targeting them because they believed that they were carrying COVID, and a lot of discrimination. And it's unfortunate that those occurrences had to happen, but it kind of shows that I think psychologically, whenever there's an incident that is traumatic, like 9/11 or with the coronavirus, people want to blame people immediately. People want to find the people who did it, find the people who might be in on it, find the people who, whatever reason supported it or created the virus, etc. They might want to go and blame them immediately. And unfortunately, they blame the collective because we live in a society where, although it's individualistic, you're also a part of a collective. Like you could be a part of a social group or a political party, and they put you in that group and they put labels on you. And that was also a thing after 9/11. People were put into labels. He's a Muslim. That means he could be a terrorist. And there were all these unfortunate labels that were put on it. And it's unfair. And it's unfair. And although there was a lot of hope in nationalism and pride, there was also times for a lot of people who maybe were immigrants to this country from, I don't know, somewhere in the Middle East, and they were not, allowed in, or they were not a part of, that community because people feared them. People didn't understand them, and that's what's unfortunate about times of crisis.
Yeah, I mean, and then if we turn back to the foreign policy side, I think we talked a lot about this in terms of, you know, what causes these kinds of attacks in terms of our involvement in the Middle East and sort of the radicalization of Islam.
Mm,
Ultimately, it's a very sort of it's a very nuanced conversation that requires a lot of expertise and knowledge in what happened in those areas. But
exactly.
I mean, people don't really have that much time to research all that
Hmm.
stuff.
Hmm. And a
So
lot of people, yeah, a lot of people did not know what was going on in Afghanistan at the time. People were not really, a lot of people may have heard of Al Qaeda, but they didn't really know who Osama bin Laden was or who Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri, who he was as well. And also people who were militants from other countries that came together, and all that of the history too, because, you know, there are all these claims that the US armed Al Qaeda at the time was the Mujahideen. And this goes all the way back to the late 70s, with the Soviets trying to overtake Afghanistan. And they failed, and it was a big shock. But it was a time when the US had to support then the Mujahideen and help them with arms, which later became a de facto of Al Qaeda. Um, but it shows that the history of the Middle East, and not just Afghanistan but also Iraq, you had
Syria,
Kuwait as well, Syria, all those countries, they were, all in turmoil pretty much throughout. And during those times, this allowed a lot of terror groups to come to power. You had the Taliban, who did not have ambitions to rule the world, but you had Al Qaeda, who did, where Al Qaeda wanted to create a caliphate. And now you have ISIS as well, but you had all these terrorist groups and people who belong to terrorist groups that had their intentions on the U.S. They saw the U.S. as, um, the biggest enemy to them. And there was a lot of radicalization that was involved, especially with Islam. But Islam should not be a part of it because the people who are part of these groups were um, radical. They don't really follow the um, pillars of Islam because they act in violence. They um, they act in hatred. They don't act in the morals of um, what the Muslim religion is about. And that's where they became a new group. They wanted to be, quote unquote, have a holy struggle within their own organization, which jihad means, holy struggle. Um, and that led them to see Americans as the other. And, this resulted also in, anti-American imperialism as well, because the US was involved in a lot of Middle Eastern um, politics and foreign policy for quite a while, not just since the 2000s. This has been going back for decades. And they also saw the US as, they were anti-American from the start. And that's what also was about. And you have the clash of civilizations as well that Huntington, the political scientist, also discussed as well in the 90s. And that, unlike what most of foreign policy was in the 20th century, with that being ideological, with communism and capitalism, this new era was going to be of cultures, basically the Mick versus the Mac world, and also, the Christians versus the Muslims versus the Jews. And it was going to be about, your creed, where you're from, what cultural values you have, and how that was going to be used as a way of, these are the people we're going to war with. So it was kind of like this new crusades, if you put it in light terms, with how this new foreign policy was put in place because of what was going on in the Middle East, specifically with these terror organizations.
Yeah, and there's a lot of things to unpack in terms of the motivations behind Bin Laden, the funding of another thing we didn't mention was the Saudis' role in this,
Mm-hmm.
and how they played a huge part in sort of funding Bin Laden's operations. And I mean, we're still very involved in terms of the affairs that go on with Saudi Arabia, to the point where we could pretty much call them allies.
Yeah.
So
The Middle East. Yeah, go ahead.
So it's a lot of complex sort of moving parts going around in terms of why we invade there. A lot of people tend to scapegoat it towards oh, they got the oil, so we're just gonna go get it all.
Exactly.
Like the reason why, actually, I don't think Afghanistan doesn't really have that much oil. The most
no, but they have a lot of
they have a lot of opioids.
Yeah,
Oxytocin.
opioids. Yep.
And a lot of it is pretty truthful in terms of, we want to prevent any sort of global terrorist threat.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, it's just like, it becomes like a game of, how much can you control a nation for? And we're seeing that realized now with the whole entire pullout of Afghanistan and that debate that's going on. I mean, that was the biggest pull for a reason. So
yeah. And you saw that from the beginning. Their main intentions were to find Bin Laden and his perpetrators, and to bring them to justice. That was the main goal. And you saw that with Afghanistan in the beginning. In 2011, they officially killed Bin Laden. In 2016 or 17, they killed one of the big generals in ISIS. And they also killed a lot of high-profile terrorists along the way, both of Al Qaeda and of ISIS. And it was time. President Trump introduced this last year, and President Biden wanted to follow through, and he did. And a couple of weeks ago now, getting all our troops out of Afghanistan. And now there are plans to get them out of Iraq by the end of the year. There have been reports of that. It also could be delayed now. There's about 2,500 troops right now in Iraq, but there could be. I know that some officials are a little skeptic of this because they want to still have troops in the Middle East to surveil Iran, who we have had some pretty iffy tensions within the past year and a half, and also to surveil everything else going on, especially now with the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, and all our interests also in the Middle East. But to bring it back about Afghanistan, the plan was to make it more democratic, to build institutions, to make it stable, to make it so that people could live and prosper there. And I mean, it's easier said than done. It takes a long time to build a democracy. You're going to have the first peaceful transition of power, which in a lot of countries that have never had a democracy, that's a very tough task. You would also need to be able to have a strong economy, one where it would be fair and open to all. And that is not the case in Afghanistan. You'd also need to adopt more, Western, unfortunately, people don't like the term that, but Western values, um, trying to make a more, you know, equitable society, which never came to be. And there were efforts to, build schools and build institutions and allow both females and males to go to school. But with the Taliban, that never came to be. And also with Iraq as well, that was a tragedy in itself. And how the Middle East has been, a place where it's been unstable for such a long time that, even if you tried a democracy build, it would probably fall apart because there really is no prior history of that, in the modern era.
Yeah, I mean, we invested a lot in just Afghanistan in general. I think it ranged
Mhm.
about like 15 billion per year,
Yeah, $6 trillion in total for the war on terror.
which is, I mean, that's a lot of money. It's a lot of taxpayer dollars.
And plus with the debt, you know, that didn't help the national debt, which is now about 29 trillion, or it's even up more than
Yeah,
that.
we're approaching that 30.
Yeah, you were close to it anyways. I mean, that doesn't help with, you know, the debt. That doesn't help with trying to cut expenditures. That doesn't help, anything really. It's just costly. And also, 900,000 people lost their lives just around there. Um, so it's been both costly monetarily and also costly towards, humans. And that's also a tough pill to swallow.
Yeah, but
So
tons of families, not just American families,
I know
have
tons of
been
families,
negatively affected by this.
yeah, it's not just Americans, even though there are a lot were Americans, but you also had our allies in the UK, France, Korea, Canada. The list goes on and on of people who served, and I mean, our allies in Iraq who helped in Afghanistan and Syria. A lot of people gave their lives to fight for a cause that they may have not grown up in because they lived in a country, but they wanted to serve their country and give their life up to make it better. And that's the sacrifice we need to appreciate every day and be grateful that there were people out there that, were selfless and that they took the time out of their life to go serve and risk their lives. And if they did come home, a lot of them may now unfortunately have a lot of different, they might have PTSD, they might have been injured, and for the rest of their lives they're going to have to learn to live with that. And that's an unfortunate thing that occurred, but it shows how selfless and how they wanted to be a hero either way, and they wanted to risk their lives. And it's something that, although we can talk about monetary, we can talk about money all we want, with how much spending went on, the loss of human life is so much more important than a stack of dollars.
Yeah, and we can circle this back in terms of our own personal experiences because as you've said, we both grew up in areas where 9/11
Mm,
was a tragedy for both of us because we were both negatively impacted by it.
yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah. I grew up in. I'm from Boston, people, so I grew up in the Boston area, and two of the four flights came out of Boston. They were intended to go to Los Angeles, but as we all know, that didn't occur. And there were a lot of people within the surrounding communities that lost loved ones. And I mean, if you go to Boston today, I believe there's a 9/11 memorial there, um, that honors all the local Bostonians and people who live in the surrounding communities that passed away. And I just remember I was an infant. I was around 2 years old um, at that time, and I just remember hearing about it, but I never really heard about what happened. I was only an infant, so I think I was watching Barney that day, but I do remember that my mom and my dad my dad heard about it and then he called my mom. And that's literally the story that I heard that 9/11 occurred. And I know that a lot of people have their stories, but mine was that I was just sitting out home and then my mom switched the channel. Oh, she got a phone call, then switched the channel, and then moved me out of the room immediately. Um, and that's all I remember. I mean, that's what I was told. And I see to this day that there were people in the surrounding communities that I lived in that were impacted, and um, I can only feel for how they feel. But yeah, that's kind of like what my story is. But growing up in the greater Boston area, I did see there were a lot of people impacted within the communities, the surrounding communities. But Big Don, you want to share a little bit about your personal
Yeah,
stories
I
and
mean, I had a very similar account to you. I was watching Sesame Street, and my mom got the call, or I guess it was the email that the World Trade Centers were on fire. But I mean, I grew up around New York, so I think everyone knew someone that was impacted by like 9/11. Like I remember every anniversary, we used to have in like social studies class. Everyone had their own sort of personal accounts of oh my dad was like a firefighter and he was going into like Manhattan that day, or like someone like oh my father worked in sort of Wall Street or even the World Trade Center, and then you hear stories about like how they evacuated or maybe their train was running by behind. I had family that worked in Midtown Manhattan, so it was a very surreal day for them in terms of because everyone pretty much had to leave that day.
Mm,
People, people were not messing around because obviously any sort of landslide, there's a lot of
yeah,
areas within New York City that could be potential terrorist targets, and you always hear stories. We've had plenty of people within the surrounding area of me. There are firefighters that were impacted with 9/11 illnesses. You hear like some stories of people who actually lost loved ones in the
mm,
surrounding community. And then obviously from like an outsider perspective, people who got like a clear view of the World Trade Center would just watch it unfold live.
yeah, and then
Remember my
yep,
grandmother lives all the way in Connecticut, but you could see the Manhattan skyline if you go all the way out to Long Island Sound. So people were just crowding around there.
mm,
And at the end of the day, I mean, people don't realize the sheer amount of impact that they have on an entire community of people,
mhm.
even 20 years later. So
Yeah, and I was actually driving through New York City a couple weeks ago, and there was an ad that played, and I remember I know when I got older, I started watching the documentaries, and that day, a lot of people went outside, went walking around in the surrounding New York communities, either in Upper Manhattan or wherever, or people who were just going around strolling when the first tower came down and the second one eventually came down in the late morning. And a lot of people, were either inhaling the smoke and the dust that occurred after the towers collapsed. And, I heard that commercial and it said, if any one of anyone who has died of cancer within the past, 10 years, you may be eligible. And if you lived um, in the surrounding in the New York, greater New York area, you may qualify. And, you know,
yeah, you
uh,
see those ads all the time on TV
and
where
I
I
mean,
come from.
I'm not from New York. I was just driving through, but I mean, I heard all about how, a lot of people and firefighters and police and also first responders, EMTs, etc. How, they came in and later on in life, they either got, lung cancer, um, emphysema, all these respiratory diseases.
Yeah, I remember back then when the cleanup was just beginning, the EPA declared the air of Lower Manhattan to be safe, but in fact, it wasn't.
Mm.
You still had all that dust and debris and
Chemicals, yeah.
all those chemicals
Carcinogens too, yeah.
that come from all that concrete and steel and that jet fuel.
Yeah.
I mean, that pollutes the air, all right.
Hmm. Yeah, that's not healthy to breathe in. And I think, yeah, I mean, people, might have not have thought of that like back in the day. And, I think there were advisories to wear a mask, or if you go outside, really limit your time. Um, and I mean, the EPA, may have not have thought this through and saying that, oh, maybe the air quality was, going to stay somewhat safe, but it was really underestimated. And now today, as you know, how unhealthy that air quality was and how catastrophic it has been for some people and their health.
Yeah, you think about the cleanup after,
Mm,
like down in ground zero, trying to find. We kind of related this to what happened in Florida this year,
yeah.
but people spent months down there trying to make the recovery effort, or even like this went on for years,
Hmm.
and it got to the point where we had there's a lot of firefighters and policemen going down there. Only one photographer was allowed there, and if you guys are decide to go to New York for a day, I recommend checking out the 9/11 Museum Workshop, where you can meet the guy who was the official 9/11 photographer.
Mm.
No, not sponsored, but there you go.
That's definitely something, yeah, you guys all have to check out. I still have not gone, but I'd really like to go and, see all the pictures and all the documents.
And everything there is very surreal.
Mm,
But we reflect on that now, and I guess the best thing we can learn here is how can we prevent something like this? That's the point of history.
it is. As they say, those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And, you see it today, if people do not know it. And I mean, we live, that was 20 years ago, so a lot of people still know, but you see people, most people have not lived through World War One. You have some people that are still alive to recount World War Two and the horrors. You have some people who can recount Pearl Harbor, some people that can recount um Nazism and the Holocaust. But
But now
when those
today,
people, yeah.
the vast majority of people in this country can probably recount where they were when they found that these events were taking place.
Hmm. But I mean, as time progresses, is this going to be taught? That's the fear. And I think that those who do not learn, or those who are maybe too, I don't want to say they're too stupid, but maybe too, who don't care, they could repeat it. I mean, this could be unfortunately repeated. And it just shows you how, we really need to take history seriously, and people really need to learn it, because if they don't, um, an event, maybe not as wide as this, but whatever future it may endure, something could occur.
Yeah, and that's right there is the double truth.
The double truth. It is true. So all of you, study your history.
That's right. Eat your eat, consume your vitamins, eat your breakfast, and you should be set for life.
Exactly.
But anyways, I think that's going to wrap it up here for us.
Yes.
We're
That is
keeping
going to
it
wrap it up.
keeping it fairly short tonight because we just want to keep it pretty straightforward. We're not going
Yeah.
to really go into current events today, even though we talked a little bit about some of the parallels and a little bit about the speeches today.
Yes. Yeah, we really wanted to make this live stream, dedicated to 9/11, the stories and the aftermath, whatever that was, all the occurrences that occurred after 9/11. We really wanted to touch on, from foreign policy to Islamophobia. We wanted to talk about everything that has impacted our lives since then. And today that was what we wanted to do. We wanted to just talk about 9/11. Today's the 20th anniversary. We wanted to go over everything that occurred on that day. And we also just wanted to speak on our own truth and our own perspective. And, you know, we really appreciate all those who could tune in today. Thank you again. This was more of a solemn episode. Usually our other stuff is a lot more, joyful, but since it is such a solemn day for a lot of people, we really appreciate you all for respecting that. And just before we go, I just want to say, um, our thoughts and our prayers are with everyone who was impacted um, by that unfortunate day. Our thoughts and prayers are with all those first responders, people in law enforcement, medics, first responders that went to the Pentagon, that went to the World Trade Center, and also that went to Shanksville, and all those who were killed on the flights as well. And since then, all those active duty and former duty who decided to go serve our country against the war on terror.
Yeah, prayers go out to all those people that were
We will
affected
never
by this
forget.
tragedy.
We will never forget.
All right, that's gonna do us for tonight. Make sure to follow us on all our social medias. We got the Twitter up right here. We'll be back to posting our regular polls.
Yes, yes. Thank you all again, and peace.
Peace.